My name is Carly. I am 38 years old and a major in the United States Marine Corps. Today I stood under the gray-spitting rain of Ohio to bury my father. But the most rotten thing in this cemetery was not death. It was my own flesh and blood. 3 years ago, my older sister stole my fiancé. Now standing inches from our father's casket, she hooked her arm through his, leaned in, and smirked. Poor thing, 38 and totally alone. Nobody wants a stiff, dried-up soldier like you. Their eyes dragged up and down my uniform with absolute disgust, looking at me like a pathetic failure. But I did not cry. I just gave them a dead cold smile. Is that so? Then have you met my husband? I raised my hand. A man stepped out of a black armored Cadillac and walked toward us. Her smile vanished. Her hands covered in cheap, flashy jewelry started to shake. Before I tell you exactly what happened, type the word power in the comments. If you believe the most brutal revenge is massive success. Do not forget to hit like and subscribe to see how karma completely crushed this traitor. The whispers of my relatives crawled across the wet, sinking headstones like roaches. I stood at strict attention. My polished Corfam heels sank deep into the thick, freezing Ohio mud, but I did not shift my weight. I did not flinch. My spine was a steel rod. My shoulders squared beneath the heavy, dark fabric of my dress blues. My eyes were locked dead on the brass handles of the oak casket. I was here for the man in the box. Nothing else. But you cannot ignore a parasite when it is standing right next to you. Vanessa floated into my peripheral vision. She wore a plunging black dress cut so low it belonged in a cheap downtown nightclub, not a graveyard. She did not look at our father's picture. She did not bow her head. Instead, her sharp, hungry eyes darted across the crowd under the canvas tent. She was taking inventory. She was calculating exactly how many male cousins were staring at her chest and how many of our aging aunts were gasping at the rock on her left hand. A cubic zirconia the size of a quail egg masquerading as a diamond. Her perfume, a suffocating synthetic wave of cheap gardenia, slammed into my face, overpowering the natural smell of wet earth and pine needles. Her mere presence threw dirty water on the final shred of dignity my father had left. This was not a somber farewell. It was a grotesque middle-class runway show, a desperate plea for attention. Gravel crunched loudly behind us, the heavy, deliberate sound of expensive tires rolling up the cemetery drive. Darren stepped out of a black Mercedes S-Class. The dealership plates were still on the back, a dead giveaway of a weekend rental, but the crowd of relatives did not know any better. He adjusted his silk tie, shot his cuffs, and tilted his chin up. He marched toward the burial tent like a wealthy politician inspecting his loyal peasants. He was not here to mourn a dead man. He was here to establish dominance over the living. He stopped right in front of me, completely ignoring the casket. His breath smelled like stale black coffee mints and pure arrogance. "Hello, Carly," he said. His voice dripped with fake plastic pity. It was the tone of a master speaking to a stray dog. "I heard you are still hiding out on that miserable base on the West Coast. Just you and the grunts. Such a shame." He paused, letting the silence hang so the aunts and uncles leaning in could hear every single word. "You know," he continued, a vicious little smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, "if you had just learned how to be a real woman, if you were just a little softer, a little less rigid, maybe you would be living the good life right now. Like Vanessa." It was a calculated surgical strike. A psychological hit meant to break me in public. He needed to prove his superiority to the crowd. He needed to validate his betrayal. He needed everyone in this mud-soaked cemetery to know that cheating on me with my own sister was not a sin. It was the brilliant, justified choice of a highly successful man trading up. Around us, the flock of vultures shifted. Uncle Bob, wearing a suit that smelled like mothballs and cheap cigars, started nodding slowly. The rest of the bloodline followed suit. They threw looks of cheap, pathetic sympathy in my direction. "Poor Carly," Uncle Bob muttered loud enough to make sure I heard it. "All that rank, all those medals on her chest, and not a single man willing to look at her twice. What a waste." In their twisted, superficial reality, his logic was flawless. A Marine Corps uniform earned through blood-broken bones and absolute hell in foreign deserts meant absolutely nothing to them. Honor had no market value here. My service, my sacrifices held zero weight compared to the shiny silver logo glued to the hood of Darren's rented German car. They measured the worth of a human life in Carlise's fake jewelry and maxed-out credit cards. I squeezed my hands into fists. The crisp white fabric of my ceremonial gloves stretched dangerously tight over my knuckles. I pressed my fingernails into my palms, digging deeper and deeper until the skin broke. I felt the warm, wet sting of blood pooling against the cotton inside the glove. Pain grounds you. Pain keeps the monster in the cage. Out in the field, in the sandbox, I trusted my life to the men and women standing to my left and my right. We bled for each other without question. But here in the place I was supposed to call my hometown, the very people sharing my DNA were twisting rusted knives into my spine. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break my bearing. A commanding officer never ever exposes an open wound to the enemy. I kept my breathing slow, rhythmic, and entirely invisible. I stared right through Darren, rendering him absolutely non-existent. Darren scoffed at my silence. My refusal to react infuriated him. He turned his back to me dismissively and walked over to the wooden podium, holding the leather-bound guest registry. He reached inside his tailored vest pocket and pulled out a heavy, blindingly gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted them to see the wealth dripping from his fingers. He gripped the barrel. He flicked his wrist to remove the cap. Click. The sharp, heavy metallic sound sliced straight through the damp, heavy silence of the graveyard. That click did not just hit my eardrums. It bypassed my discipline. It pierced straight through my Kevlar armor. It was not the sound of a pen cap. It was the exact, undeniable sound of heavy metal and diamond slamming violently against a tempered glass coffee table in a suffocating room 3 years ago. The gray-spitting rain of Ohio suddenly blurred and washed away. The freezing wind stopped biting at my neck. In a fraction of a second, the crushing humid heat of a summer night slammed hard into my chest, dragging me straight down into the darkest hell of my past. 3 years ago, I was 35. I had just rotated back stateside after a grueling 6-month deployment in the Middle East. I stood outside the heavy glass doors of Darren's downtown architecture firm. I had not even gone back to base to shower. My Marpat utility uniform was stiff with dried sweat, smelling faintly of diesel fuel, burned sand, and the stale recycled air of a military transport plane. My tactical boots felt like they weighed 10 pounds each. My body was operating on pure adrenaline and a brutal jet lag. In my left hand, I carried a plastic bag of pad thai from the spot on 4th Street, his favorite. In a world built on life-or-death decisions, calculated risks, and constant hypervigilance, I had stupidly convinced myself that Darren was my safe harbor, my civilian anchor. Innocence is the most fatal blind spot a soldier can have. The hallway was completely empty. It was past 9 on a Friday night. My rubber soles made zero noise on the commercial carpet. I was a ghost moving through a sterile, air-conditioned tunnel. 10 steps away from his office door, I stopped. My senses dialed up from half a year in a combat zone caught something completely out of place. It cut right through the smell of my own exhaustion and the spicy peanut sauce in the bag. Gardenia. A heavy, cloying, aggressively sweet perfume. It was unmistakable. It was the exact scent Vanessa bought by the gallon at the department store counter. I froze. The heavy oak door to Darren's office was cracked open about 2 inches. The lights inside were dim. And then the sound hit me. It was clear. Unmistakable. The high, breathless giggle of my own flesh and blood tangled up with a low, heavy groan. Darren's groan. I did not barge in. I stood there perfectly still, letting the reality of the situation pour over me like a bucket of ice water. "Do not worry about her," Vanessa cooed. Her voice was muffled, thick with cheap lust. "Carly is as dry as a piece of sandpaper. She does not know a single thing about passion. She just plays dress-up in men's clothes to hide how pathetic she really is. A real man needs a woman, Darren. Not a soldier." My hand went completely numb. There was no sudden rush of tears, no dramatic gasp for air, no screaming. My brain simply bypassed human emotion and went straight into a cold, clinical survival mode. The kind you need when the convoy hits an IED. My fingers went slack. Thud. The plastic bag slipped from my grip. It hit the floor hard. The styrofoam container busted open inside, spilling hot noodles and dark brown sauce all over the beige carpet. The noise was not loud, but in that dead quiet hallway, it sounded like a mortar dropping. The giggling inside the office stopped instantly. I pushed the heavy oak door all the way open. It swung wide and slammed against the drywall. The scene in front of me was a psychological slaughter. They were scrambled together on his expensive black leather sofa. Darren was pale, scrambling backward, desperately yanking up his trousers with shaking hands. He looked exactly like what he was, a coward caught in a trap of his own making. But what made the blood in my veins completely freeze over was not the raw betrayal. It was not seeing the man I was going to marry half naked with my older sister. It was what she was wearing. Vanessa was sitting up, pulling a piece of clothing over her chest to cover herself. She shot me a look of pure, toxic triumph. A sick little smile played on her lips. She was wearing my blouse, my desert camouflage uniform jacket, the one I had left in his closet before I deployed, the one with the eagle globe and anchor stenciled on the pocket, the one with the name tape stitched directly over the left breast. Spears. That jacket represented blood. It represented nights shivering in a forward operating base. It represented men and women who did not make it home. And my sister was wearing it like a cheap piece of lingerie, mocking my entire existence. It was not just infidelity. It was a desecration. She was planting a flag on my life, claiming dominance over everything I had ever fought for. Darren finally found his voice. It cracked. "Carly. Baby, wait, I can explain." He sounded like a child. Pathetic. Small. What does a Marine do when caught in an unpredicted ambush? You do not panic. You do not negotiate with the enemy. You assess the tactical situation and you execute a calculated withdrawal. I reached down to my left hand. I twisted the diamond engagement ring off my finger. The metal felt dirty against my skin. I tossed it. It flew across the room and hit the heavy glass coffee table. Clink! The hard metallic snap echoed in the room, sharp and final as a bullet racking into a chamber. "You two pieces of garbage deserve each other," I said. My voice was dead, flat, devoid of a single drop of the emotion they wanted to see. I did not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I denied them my tears. I turned around on my heel. My combat boots stepped directly through the ruined pile of takeout food in the hallway, tracking grease down the pristine carpet. I walked away. I left the coward. I left the venomous snake I called a sister. And I left the last shred of my civilian innocence in that room. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your life, I need you to know you are not alone. Drop a survivor down in the comments right now, hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes walking away without a word is the deadliest weapon you have. I hit the underground garage, shoved the key into my ignition, and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the concrete. I blew past the toll booth and merged onto the empty interstate. The blackness of the American night swallowed my car whole, wrapping around me as I drove into a war I had to fight entirely alone. That very same night, I filed the paperwork for an emergency transfer. Coast to coast, I requested orders for Camp Pendleton on the West Coast, putting 3,000 miles of concrete and desert between myself and the wreckage of my life in Ohio. I drove the entire way in a numbing robotic trance. I did not turn on the radio. I did not cry. I survived on burnt, bitter black coffee from truck stops and the hypnotic hum of the highway tires. When I arrived in California, I refused the base housing meant for a field-grade officer. I needed cheap, dirt cheap. I rented a rundown ground floor apartment in a shady complex right next to the industrial zone in Oceanside. The drywall was paper thin. The carpet was stained. The entire place reeked of the previous tenant's stale cigarette smoke and bleach. I did not care about comfort. I only cared about cash. My father's pancreatic cancer had taken a massive turn for the worse. The American healthcare system does not care about grief. It only cares about billing codes, co-pays, deductibles, out-of-network specialist fees. The numbers were terrifying. I knew for a fact that Vanessa and Darren were not going to pull a single dime out of their pockets to keep our father breathing. So I did what a soldier does. I carried the weight. On the first of every single month, I took 80% of my major's salary. I took every single cent of my hazard pay saved up from getting shot at in the sandbox. I wired it all directly into a joint family account designated for my father's medical bills. I bled my own bank account dry to buy him time. For 6 grueling months, my daily rations consisted of 25-cent packets of chicken-flavored ramen noodles bought in bulk from the discount store down the street. I could not afford a dining table. I did not even own a chair. Every night, I sat cross-legged on the freezing, cracked linoleum floor of my kitchen. I stared at the peeling paint on the cabinets while slurping down salty, processed broth. On base, I operated like a soulless machine. I engineered massive Pacific supply chain logistics with brutal, flawless precision. I barked orders. I demanded perfection from my Marines. But the second I unlocked the deadbolt to that crappy apartment, the engine died. I collapsed. The silence of that empty room was deafening, and in that silence, Vanessa's venomous words from that night in the office started to eat through my armor like battery acid. Carly is as dry as a piece of sandpaper. She just plays dress-up in men's clothes to hide how pathetic she really is. Gaslighting is a slow, quiet poison. It does not hit you all at once. It drips into your brain when you are exhausted. Was she right? Was I just a rigid, unlovable piece of military hardware? I could withstand the concussive shockwave of a mortar round, but the vicious, selfish cruelty of my own family was snapping my spine in half. I was drowning inside my own fortress. I was starving myself to keep them afloat, and they treated me like collateral damage. Then came the night that nearly broke me for good. I was sitting on the floor picking at a styrofoam cup of noodles. The apartment was pitch black, save for the harsh, cold blue light glowing from my phone screen. I opened Instagram. A post from Vanessa popped up at the top of my feed. The brightness of the photo felt like a physical slap to the face. It was a picture of her and Darren. They were lounging at an all-inclusive 5-star resort in Cabo San Lucas. The water behind them was a brilliant crystal-clear turquoise. Vanessa was holding a tropical cocktail in a hollowed-out pineapple. Her left hand was strategically angled toward the camera lens to show off a massive, blindingly bright new diamond ring. The caption read, "Finally found my soulmate. Living my best life. #blessed, #paradise." My stomach violently cramped. The cheap noodles suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked down at the 25-cent cup of soup in my lap. I looked around at the dark, freezing walls of my empty apartment. I was the one living by a code of honor. I was the one sacrificing my livelihood, my youth, and my sanity to keep our father alive. And the blood traitor who stabbed me in the back was sipping imported rum in a Mexican paradise. Where did they get the money for a luxury vacation while our father was dying in a hospital bed? Darren's architecture firm was struggling. Vanessa barely worked a part-time retail job. The answer hit me like a sledgehammer to the ribs. The joint medical account. The money I'd been wiring home every month. They were not just ignoring the bills, they were skimming it. They were using my hazard pay to fund their fake, flashy lifestyle. The injustice was so heavy it crushed the air out of my lungs. I threw the cup of noodles across the room. It bounced off the wall, splattering greasy broth everywhere. I slid down the drywall until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. Vanessa was right. I was a pathetic failure. I was not a daughter or a sister. I was just an ATM. A disposable tool for them to bleed dry. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I walked out to the base parking lot. The Pacific fog was thick, and a heavy freezing rain was coming down in sheets. My eyes were bloodshot. My head was completely empty. I had my end of active service paperwork folded in my pocket. I was done. I was going to turn in my rifle, resign my commission, and let the darkness win. I reached out, grabbing the cold metal handle of my car door. Slam. A massive calloused hand slammed down flat on the hood of my car, vibrating the metal. I flinched, stepping back. Standing there in the pouring rain, ignoring the water soaking through her utility uniform, was Master Gunnery Sergeant Ruth. An E9, a legend on base. She stepped into my space, leaning in close until her face was inches from my windshield. She stared right through me with eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a straight razor. Slam! The noise rattled my teeth. Standing in the freezing Pacific rain, ignoring the water soaking right through her uniform, was Master Gunnery Sergeant Ruth. She was in her early 50s, hard as coffin nails. A thick, jagged scar ran up the left side of her neck, a brutal souvenir from the Gulf War. She did not wait for me to roll down the window. She grabbed the handle and yanked my car door wide open. "You are wearing the face of a casualty, Major," Ruth growled. The rain was dripping off her chin, but her eyes were dead locked on mine. "I do not take orders from an officer who lets her own past defeat her. Get out." I blinked, my brain foggy and slow. "Master Gunny, I said get out of the damn car, Spears." She reached in, grabbed the shoulder of my jacket, and hauled me out into the downpour. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer me a shoulder to cry on. She shoved me into the passenger seat of her mud-caked Ford F-150 and threw it in gear. She drove us straight off base to a dark, windowless dive bar, favored by the older vets. The place smelled like bleached, stale draft beer and 30 years of bad decisions. Ruth dragged a stool out for me. She threw a $20 bill on the sticky wooden bar top. "2 wells, neat," she told the bartender. He slid 2 thick glasses of cheap brown whiskey across the wood. Ruth pushed one into my hand. "Drink," she ordered. I swallowed it whole. The cheap alcohol burned like battery acid going down my throat, tearing the fog right out of my head. Ruth tapped a thick, calloused finger against her empty glass. "I know about the transfer. I know about the paperwork in your pocket. I know you are starving yourself to pay bills for people who would not spit on you if you were on fire." I looked down at the scratched wood. "You do not understand. They are my family. If I do not do it, who will?" Ruth let out a short, harsh laugh. "Family. Your family has actively chosen to act like the enemy. So why in the hell are you treating them like allies?" The question hit me directly in the chest. A sniper round through the ribs. Ruth leaned in close. I could smell the sharp tang of the whiskey on her breath. "Being soft is not the only way to be a woman, Carly," she said, her voice dropping lower, cutting straight through the noise of the jukebox in the corner. "And your discipline. It is not dryness. It is not pathetic. Loyalty, the ability to carry heavy weight, the strength to protect the people around you. That is dignity. You are armor-piercing ammunition, Major. Do not ever let a bunch of hollow civilian cowards tell you your worth." She stood up, tossed another $5 on the bar for the tip, and walked out. She left me sitting there in the dark. But she did not leave me empty. She had just handed me back the keys to my own brain. That night, the wall of victimhood inside me collapsed. The next morning at 04:30, I laced up my running shoes. I hit the Pacific Coast Highway. I ran until the muscles in my calves burned like fire. I ran until my lungs screamed for oxygen. I ran until the blisters on the back of my heels burst and bled through my socks. Physical pain washes away the mental ghosts. With every heavy step on the asphalt, I burned Vanessa out of my system. I burned Darren out. I was a United States Marine. My oath was to never surrender. Why was I surrendering my mind to domestic enemies? I stopped on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The sun was coming up sharp and blinding. The beast was finally awake. Later that week, I drove to a high-end department store. I walked straight past the cosmetic counters selling the shiny, pale pink lip glosses that Vanessa always worshipped. The kind of makeup meant to look cute and fragile. I stopped at a counter and picked out a heavy matte lipstick. The color was a deep, dark burgundy. It was the exact color of dried blood on a field bandage. I bought it. I stood in front of the mirror in the store restroom and dragged it across my lips. This was not makeup. This was not meant to attract a man or look pretty for a camera. This was war paint. It was the color of survival. I looked myself dead in the eyes in the glass. The crying was over. My silence was no longer going to be submission. My silence was now the deep breath before pulling the trigger. I withdrew the transfer request. I threw the end of active service paperwork into a shredder. I went back to work with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Without the psychological dead weight holding me down, my performance skyrocketed. I stopped hiding in the background. I took charge. I engineered logistics networks so tight they caught the attention of the brass back east. 6 months later, I stepped out of an elevator in Arlington, Virginia. The Pentagon. My polished uniform shoes clicked a deadly steady rhythm against the pristine marble floors of the E-Ring. I was no longer a victim hiding in a cheap apartment. I was the lead logistics negotiator for a massive Pacific defense contract. I adjusted the stack of classified folders under my arm. I reached out and pushed open the heavy double doors of the briefing room. And in that room, smelling of black coffee and raw quiet power, I found the ultimate defense system I never knew I was looking for. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the briefing room in the Pentagon. Sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table was Marcus Hamilton, CEO of Apex Defense, the largest logistics contractor on the East Coast. Darren had always needed giant designer logos plastered across his chest to hide how empty he was inside. Marcus was the exact opposite. He was the absolute definition of quiet luxury. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that absorbed the fluorescent light rather than reflecting it. There was no flashy gold watch, no arrogance in his posture, just a deep, terrifyingly calm authority. I stood at the podium and delivered my presentation on the tactical vulnerabilities of the Pacific supply lines. I spoke for 45 minutes straight. Not once did Marcus touch his phone. Not once did his eyes drift down to my chest or my legs the way the civilian contractors usually did. He sat perfectly still, taking deliberate notes with an old silver fountain pen. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Marcus screwed the cap back onto his pen. He looked me dead in the eyes. Major Spears. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried easily across the large room. That is the most ruthless, bulletproof structural analysis I have heard in 10 years. You just saved my corporation $4 million. He did not flirt with me to stroke his own ego. He did not talk down to me. He honored my brain. He honored the soldier standing in front of him. Weeks later, he did not take me to some loud 5-star restaurant with crystal chandeliers to show me off like a shiny new hood ornament. He took me to a hole-in-the-wall steakhouse in Alexandria that had sawdust on the floor and the best rib-eye on the seaboard. When we walked out into the cold night air, he did not hit a key fob from 50 feet away to make a sports car beep. He walked me over to a heavy black Volvo SUV. He opened the heavy passenger door for me himself. I raised an eyebrow at the car. Not exactly a CEO's typical ride. Marcus smiled, shutting my door with a heavy vault-like thud. He got into the driver's seat and started the engine. "It is the safest heavy-duty vehicle on the market," he said, pulling out into traffic. "I do not need to drive fast to impress people I do not care about. I just need to be absolutely sure that the people inside this car get home in one piece." That was the exact moment I knew. Darren was a cheap, leaking pop-up tent trying to look like a mansion. Marcus was a concrete bunker. He noticed the jagged, faded scar under my jawline one evening while we were sitting on his porch. Darren used to call it a flaw. Darren used to suggest I wear more makeup to hide it so I could look a little more feminine. Marcus reached out. He traced the rough raised tissue with his thumb. "A mark of courage," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Do not ever cover it up." 2 years later, there was a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace of our living room. Marcus got down on one knee on the hardwood floor. He did not pull out a gaudy, flawless diamond bought on a maxed-out credit card to impress the neighbors. He opened a small velvet box. Inside rested a deep ocean blue cashmere sapphire set in heavy platinum. It did not blind you with fake light. It pulled you in. It was permanent. Inside the platinum band, he had ordered the jeweler to engrave 2 words: Semper Fidelis, always faithful, the motto of the Marine Corps. "Carly," he said, his voice as steady as bedrock. "I love the woman standing in front of me, and I worship the soldier inside you. I want to be the rear guard holding the line so you can always face forward." Darren had made 100 empty promises and shredded every single one of them with his cowardice. Marcus permanently carved his loyalty into solid metal before he even asked the question. I nodded. I did not need to say a word. I had finally found the fire team for the rest of my life. A landing zone with 0 chance of betrayal. My defensive perimeter was fully established. I was safe, but life is vicious. It knows exactly when to drag you right back into the mud. It waits for the 1 second you drop your guard, and then it strikes. The warm, crackling light of the fireplace suddenly vanished. The heat of the room was sucked out into a vacuum, replaced by the freezing, damp chill of the Ohio sky. Clink, clink, clink. The sharp, annoying sound of a metal spoon hitting the side of a cheap wine glass ripped through my eardrums. It tore me out of my memories, violently throwing me back into the present. The smoke cleared from my eyes. I was no longer in my safe house. I was standing in the cramped, suffocating living room of my childhood home. It was 2 hours after we had lowered my father into the frozen ground. The room was packed with the exact same relatives who had just mocked me at the cemetery. And standing right in the center of the room, holding up a glass of red wine with a triumphant, arrogant smirk plastered across his face, was Darren. Clink, clink, clink. The burial was over. We were back at my parents' old colonial-style house in the suburbs for the repast. The traditional post-funeral gathering where everyone eats dry ham sandwiches and pretends to be sad. Vanessa had already transformed the living room into her own personal stage. She was pacing around with a heavy pour of cheap Merlot giving orders. "Carly, go get more ice from the garage," she snapped, not even looking at me. "And honestly, take off that costume. The whole military getup is making the guests uncomfortable. It is a funeral, not a Halloween party." I slowly ground my back molars together. Costume. The dress blues I wore to salute the caskets of fallen brothers and sisters in arms reduced to a cheap joke by a woman who maxed out 3 credit cards just to buy her dress. In the center of the room, Darren tapped his Mont Blanc pen against his wine glass. The loud, annoying sound commanded the attention of the flock. "If I could have everyone's attention for a moment," Darren announced. He adjusted his suit jacket, puffing out his chest. He put on his best, deeply solemn politician face. "I just want everyone to know that Vanessa and I spared absolutely no expense for her father's care. We made sure he had the absolute best doctors, the best private room at the hospice center. We covered everything. Family is everything to us, and we were happy to foot the bill." A wave of pure, ice-cold fury shot straight up my spine. He footed the bill. The raw, verified bank statements were burned into the back of my eyelids. I knew exactly where every single dollar came from. I send 80% of my salary and every cent of my hazard pay back to this house. Darren and Vanessa did not contribute a single dime to his medical care. The only thing they ever bought for the hospital room was 2 pathetic, overpriced fruit baskets from a local grocery store. And now, standing right in front of the man's grieving family, this parasite was stealing the credit. He was building a monument to his own fake generosity using the bricks of my poverty. He was using my sacrifice to network and look good in front of Uncle Bob and the rest of the neighborhood. The relatives began to clap, a quiet, respectful round of applause for the hero. Uncle Bob raised his plastic cup of cheap beer, nodding heavily at Darren. "You are a good man, Darren. A real blessing to this family." He shot a sideways, disappointed look at me. As for Carly, well, shame she never figured out how to contribute. What a waste of an upbringing. Vanessa hooked her arm through Darren's. She glided over to where I was standing by the kitchen island, a vicious, venomous smile plastered across her face. "Darren and I were talking," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake concern, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You really should just get out of the military, Carly. Darren is willing to hire you at his firm. Administrative assistant. You can file papers, fetch coffee for the actual executives. He will pay you double whatever the government gives you. It is honest work, much better suited for a single aging woman than rolling around in the dirt with a bunch of grunts." A few people in the crowd actually chuckled. The final tripwire snapped. They did not just insult me. They were actively disrespecting the flag on my shoulder. They were trying to humiliate a Marine major, a woman who managed billion-dollar logistics networks for the Defense Department, by publicly offering to demote her to a coffee girl. They needed to force me into the role of the pathetic servant just to satisfy their own sick, twisted egos. The anger evaporated. My mind went completely terrifyingly quiet. Combat mode, engaged. I took the plastic bucket of ice I was holding and set it down on the granite counter. Thud. The heavy, dead weight of the sound instantly killed the nervous laughter in the room. I kept my eyes locked directly on Darren. I reached down to my left hand. I bit the tip of my white ceremonial glove and slowly pulled it off. I did the same with the right. I folded the pristine white cotton gloves into a perfect square and tucked them neatly into my belt. I was officially off duty. I appreciate the offer, Darren, I said. My voice was completely flat. I projected it from the diaphragm, the exact same command voice I used to control a battalion on a parade deck. It echoed off the living room walls. But I have to decline. Darren rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his wine. Do not let your pride get in the way, Carly. It is a charity offer. Take it. I'm declining, I said, emphasizing every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, because my husband would be extremely unhappy if I quit the Marine Corps to go work for a company that is currently filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The entire living room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Darren's face immediately drained of all color. The arrogant, flushed red of the wine vanished, replaced by a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to humiliate you in public only for it to blow up in their face, drop the word karma in the comments right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to see exactly how this house of cards comes crashing down. Without breaking eye contact with him, I reached into the pocket of my uniform trousers. I pulled out my phone, opened my messages, and hit send on a single pre-typed word addressed to the contact, labeled Overwatch. Execute. 2 seconds later, the sharp, piercing sound of the front doorbell rang through the house. The airstrike had arrived. The front door of the colonial house swung open. Marcus Hamilton stepped over the threshold. The physical pressure he brought into the house instantly sucked the oxygen out of the living room. He did not look like a man arriving late to a funeral repast. He looked like a 4-star general inspecting a newly conquered territory. His charcoal suit did not have a single wrinkle. His posture was terrifyingly calm. The low hum of gossip and fake sympathy completely died. Marcus did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not look at the cheap plastic plates of catered food or the people holding them. He parted the flock of relatives like Moses splitting the sea, walking a straight, deliberate line directly toward me. In his right hand, he held a simple bouquet of white tulips. My apologies for the delay, Major. His baritone voice rolled through the dead-silent room, vibrating off the walls. He handed me the flowers. The weather made clearance for the private airstrip a bit difficult this afternoon. Private airstrip. The words hung in the air like a live grenade. You could physically see the gears grinding to a halt inside the heads of my relatives. Vanessa was frozen. Her eyes were not on the flowers. They were laser-locked onto Marcus's left wrist. When he reached out, the cuff of his suit jacket pulled back just a fraction of an inch. A dull brushed steel Patek Philippe Nautilus caught the dim lighting of the living room. It did not have a single diamond on it. It did not need one. Anyone who knew anything about real money knew that piece of steel on his wrist was worth more than the entire house we were currently standing inside. Vanessa's brain finally processed the massive, unbridgeable gap in class. Shatter. The cheap glass of Merlot slipped right through Vanessa's fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and exploded. Dark red wine splattered across the beige rug, looking exactly like fresh blood. She did not even blink. She just stared. A few feet away, Darren actually took a physical step backward. Both of his knees started to shake. The smug, arrogant politician mask he had worn 3 minutes ago melted completely off his face. A heavy, foul-smelling sweat broke out across his forehead. He stared at Marcus, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish. Mr. Hamilton. Darren's voice was paper-thin. It cracked down the middle. CEO Hamilton of Apex Defense. Marcus slowly turned his head. He looked at Darren. It was not a look of anger. It was the absolute dead-eyed look of a man staring at a cockroach right before his boot comes down. Mitchell, Marcus said. There was zero warmth in his tone, just ice. I am surprised to see you here. Darren forced a sickly, terrified smile. Well, yes, sir. Family emergency, you know. We just laid my father-in-law to rest. Is that right? Marcus tilted his head slightly. I would have thought you would be locked inside your office today, frantically trying to explain a $2 million tax fraud deficit to the IRS. Several relatives in the room actually gasped. Uncle Bob, who had been aggressively cheering Darren on just moments before, quietly set his plastic cup of beer down on the side table. He took 2 slow steps backward, pressing his spine flat against the living room wall. The rats were already abandoning the sinking ship. Darren turned the color of wet chalk. He held his hands up, stuttering uncontrollably. That is a misunderstanding, sir. A complete clerical error. We are undergoing a corporate restructuring right now. Everything is fine. The firm is solid. Even now, backed against the wall, bleeding out in front of the entire family, Darren was still desperately clinging to the fake narrative of the successful businessman. He would rather die than admit he was broke. Marcus stepped forward. He placed a heavy protective arm around my waist, pulling me tight against his side. It was an absolute, unquestionable claim of territory. A titanium bunker. He looked directly at Vanessa, whose jaw was practically touching the floor. I am not an actor hired to play a part, Vanessa. Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of an executioner. I am the man who just bought out the entire Pacific Pentagon logistics contract that your fiancé was trying to bribe his way into. I am the man who initiated the audit that just liquidated his firm. He paused, letting the destruction settle over the room before delivering the kill shot. And most importantly, I am Carly's husband. We have been legally married for 2 years. Vanessa's legs completely gave out. She collapsed into one of the dining chairs, her hands gripping the wood so hard her knuckles turned white. The fake, superficial empire they had built on my blood and sweat was burning to the ground right in front of them. The illusion of wealth was dead. But as the room spun in absolute silence, I knew Marcus was not finished. The IRS was just the opening barrage to soften the target. He had not even dropped the real bomb yet. Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh. The sound was utterly devoid of humor. It was the heavy, calculated sound a predator makes right before it snaps the neck of its prey. Restructuring, Marcus repeated, tasting the word like it was dirt on his tongue. You took out a second mortgage on your dying father-in-law's house with a subprime predatory interest rate. You drained the final drops of equity out of this property just so you could rent a luxury German car and buy fake jewelry to impress a room full of people who do not even matter. That is not restructuring, Mitchell. You are not just bankrupt. By tomorrow morning, you are going to be completely homeless. The information hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A shotgun blast right to the ribs. A second mortgage. My brain short-circuited. I looked around the room. I looked at the faded floral wallpaper my mother had picked out 30 years ago. I looked at the scuffed oak floorboards where my father used to pace when he was worried. While I was sitting on a freezing linoleum floor in California, surviving on 25-cent noodles and wiring every cent of my hazard pay to keep the lights on, they had secretly leveraged the deed to this house. They had cannibalized my parents' lifetime of hard blue-collar work just to finance a fake plastic lifestyle. The absolute sheer evil of it was paralyzing. They did not just steal from me, they stole the physical foundation of our family history. Vanessa let out a horrific guttural shriek. It did not sound human. It sounded like an animal caught in the steel teeth of a bear trap. She lunged at Darren, her manicured hands grabbing fistfuls of the lapels on his expensive tailored vest. You lied to me! She screamed, spit flying from her lips. She shook him violently, her heels slipping on the rug. You told me the firm was landing massive contracts. You told me we were rich. You told me we were buying a house in the hills. Darren did not fight back. He did not grab her wrists or tell her to calm down. He just stood there, his arms hanging dead at his sides like useless appendages. The sweat was pouring down his face, now soaking into the stiff white collar of his dress shirt. His eyes were completely hollow. He was a dead man walking. Vanessa whipped her head around toward Marcus. Her perfectly contoured makeup was ruined, streaked with thick black mascara running down her cheeks. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. How do you know this? She demanded, her voice shrill and breaking. How could you possibly know about the house? It was supposed to be a private loan. Marcus took one slow step forward, pressing his physical advantage. He looked down at her with absolute suffocating disgust. Because I own the intelligence firm that ran the deep dive background check on him before I liquidated his assets? Marcus said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. I know every single move my enemies make before they even think to make it. In fact, I should probably thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for stealing this useless piece of garbage from my wife 3 years ago. You took the trash out for me. Vanessa completely lost her mind. The fragile reality she had built for herself shattered into a million jagged pieces. She looked frantically down at her left hand, then over at the deep ocean blue cashmere sapphire resting quietly on my finger. She started clawing at her own ring finger, desperately twisting the massive blinding stone until it scraped her skin raw. She finally ripped it off, holding it up like a weapon. We will just sell the ring, she shrieked at Darren, her voice echoing painfully off the ceiling. You told me it was a $50,000 investment. We will take it to a jeweler right now, we will sell it, and pay the mortgage. Marcus actually smiled. A slow, cruel, pitying smile. That is a synthetic moissanite stone, Vanessa. Marcus said softly, driving the final nail into the coffin. He bought it on Amazon for $300. Do not try to compare it to my wife's ring. You lost this war a long time ago. A manic, high-pitched wail ripped out of Vanessa's throat. She reared back and threw the fake ring straight at Darren's face with everything she had. It bounced hard off his forehead. Smack! The cheap metal hit the hardwood floor and rolled pathetically under the dusty living room sofa. I hate you, Vanessa screamed, launching herself at him again. Her acrylic nails dug into his face, scratching deep red lines down his cheek. You liar! You ruined my life. You took everything from me. Darren just stood there, taking the physical abuse. He did not even raise his hands to defend himself. The psychological execution was complete. He had nothing left to say. Marcus turned away from the pathetic scene. He swept his cold, dead eyes across the crowd of relatives. They were pressed flat against the walls, completely silent, clutching their paper plates and cheap plastic cups like frightened children caught in a crossfire. The hypocrisy in the room was thick enough to choke on. The repast is over, Marcus ordered. It was not a polite request. It was a military command. My wife needs space to mourn her father in peace. All of you. Get out of this house, right now. It took less than 2 minutes. The room emptied out like someone had just yelled, fire. The flock of vultures practically trampled each other trying to get out the front door. Vultures always scatter when they smell the rotting stench of financial ruin. Uncle Bob ducked his head, clutching his mothball-scented jacket tight against his chest, and scurried out the door without looking at me once. A few minutes ago, he was praising Darren as a hero. Now he was running away like a rat leaving a sinking ship. The house was suddenly hollow. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, sealing us inside. The only sounds left were the heavy, ragged breathing of Darren and the pathetic, gasping sobs of my sister huddled on the floor, clutching her empty left hand. Then, cutting through the silence of the wrecked living room, a cell phone started vibrating aggressively against the glass top of the coffee table. Darren's phone. The screen lit up brightly in the dim room. The caller ID was a 1-800 toll-free number. Marcus slowly walked over to the coffee table. He looked down at the glowing screen, then looked back at Darren, who was paralyzed with fear. Without asking for permission, Marcus reached out with one finger and tapped the green button, putting the call on speakerphone. Marcus pressed the green button on the vibrating phone. He hit the speaker icon. The voice that filled the dead-silent living room was female. It was completely flat, robotic, and devoid of any human empathy. It was the standard automated pre-recorded message of a corporate banking entity preparing to execute a legal slaughter. This is an urgent message for Mr. Darren Mitchell regarding the property located at this address. The automated voice announced loud and crisp. This is your final notice of default. Because your secondary mortgage account is now severely delinquent, exceeding 90 days past due, with an outstanding balance of $14,700, the bank is proceeding with immediate foreclosure. The machine paused for half a second. It was just enough time for the reality of the words to sink into the marrow of their bones. The county sheriff's department will arrive to secure and lock down the property at 0800 hours tomorrow morning. You are legally required to vacate the premises and remove all personal belongings before this time. Have a good day. Click. The call disconnected, leaving a dial tone echoing through the room. Vanessa's body simply gave out. She crumpled onto the hardwood floor, landing right in the puddle of cheap spilled Merlot. The dark red wine soaked immediately into her expensive black dress, ruining the fabric, but she did not even notice. She just sat there, her ruined makeup smearing across her face, staring blankly at the wall. Her brain was finally processing the math. She had thrown away her only loyal sister, her own flesh and blood, just to grab onto a shiny life raft. And now she realized that life raft was made of lead. She was going to lose the fake diamond ring. She was going to lose the leased German car. And by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, she was going to be thrown out onto the street, losing the very roof over her head. Darren did not bend down to help her. He did not even look at the woman he had destroyed his life to be with. Instead, the self-proclaimed successful businessman, the man who had just stood in the center of the room, demanding respect and offering to hire me as his coffee girl, dropped straight to his knees. Thud. His kneecaps hit the hard oak floorboards with a heavy, painful sound. He crawled. He actually dragged himself across the floor on his hands and knees, scrambling over the rug until he was right at my feet. The smell of his stale sweat and sour wine hit my nose. He reached out with shaking, desperate hands and grabbed onto the dark fabric of my uniform trousers. "Carly. Carly, please." He begged, his voice cracking thick with pathetic, ugly tears. He was openly weeping like a terrified child. "I know I messed up. I know I did you wrong. But please, remember how things used to be. Remember when we loved each other. Remember your parents. Your dad always liked me. He would not want to see me out on the street." A wave of pure concentrated disgust rose up in the back of my throat. It tasted like battery acid. 15 minutes ago, he was standing in front of my father's casket, stealing the credit for the hospital bills I had starved myself to pay. 15 minutes ago, he was trying to publicly humiliate me in front of my entire family, calling me a dried-up, pathetic failure. And now, backed into a corner with a financial gun to his head, he was trying to weaponize the memory of my dead father just to save his own skin. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Carly. Talk to Marcus. Just ask him to give me a small subcontract. Just enough to save the house. I will do anything. I will scrub the floors at his headquarters. I do not want to be homeless. Please save me." I looked down at the pathetic, groveling mess of a man bleeding on my boots. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of the anger I thought I would. All I felt was the cold, sterile detachment of a surgeon looking at a malignant tumor that needed to be cut out and discarded. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward. I yanked my leg back so hard the fabric of my trousers ripped out of his dirty, sweaty hands. I dusted off the spot where he had touched the uniform. "Do not ever put my parents' names in your mouth again." I growled, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. I locked my eyes onto his, piercing straight through his desperate, pathetic hope. "You used my blood money to fund your fake plastic life. You stabbed me in the back while I was overseas. You made your choices, Darren. You stood in this room 20 minutes ago, claiming to be a wildly successful man." I paused, letting the silence crush him. "So act like one. You stepped on a landmine of your own making. Now you can clean up the mess yourself." I felt Marcus's warm, heavy hand press firmly against the center of my back. It was a grounding anchor. "Let's go, Carly," Marcus said softly, his voice calm and steady. "The air in here is getting a little too toxic to breathe." I nodded once. I turned my back on the wreckage of my childhood home and walked straight toward the front door. I stepped out onto the front porch. The freezing Ohio wind immediately whipped across my face, biting at my cheeks, but I did not shiver. I felt absolutely nothing but the clean, sharp oxygen filling my lungs. In the military, they drill it into your head during combat training. You never stop to look back at a dying enemy. You keep moving forward. The pathetic, rigid, unlovable soldier that Vanessa had created in her head died permanently inside that living room. The woman walking down the driveway was entirely in control of her own fate. Behind me, from inside the house, the sounds of utter destruction began. Vanessa's hysterical, manic screaming started up again instantly, met by Darren's desperate, furious shouting. They were tearing each other to pieces like starving wild dogs, fighting over a scrap of rotten meat. I walked over to the heavy black armored Volvo SUV. I pulled open the passenger door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. Slam! The heavy thud of the car door completely cut off the screaming from the house, locking the toxic, miserable reality of my bloodline into the past forever. The private jet cut through the night sky flying west, putting thousands of miles of dark American soil between me and the state of Ohio. Inside the cabin, the steady low hum of the twin engines created a thick, insulated cocoon. It was quiet. It was safe. My combat boots rested on the plush carpet. The stiffness in my neck, built up from days of bracing for an attack, finally started to loosen. I sat in the heavy leather seats, staring down at my lap. Resting in my hands was a worn, cracked leather notebook. My father's journal. It was the only physical object I had taken from that house before Marcus and I walked out the front door and left them to burn. I opened the heavy cover. The smell of old paper dust and peppermint instantly filled my nose. I turned slowly to the very last page. The blue ballpoint ink was jagged and faint. His hand had been shaking violently from the pancreatic cancer when he wrote it, pressing so hard the pen had almost torn the paper, but the words were perfectly clear. "I know Carly is carrying the heavy weight all by herself," the entry began. "My daughter is as hard as forged steel, but even steel knows how to feel pain when you strike it. Vanessa chose the shiny surface of things. Carly chose honor. She wants to protect the world even when the world does not protect her back. I could not be more proud of my soldier. I pray to God she finds a man who knows exactly what she is worth, because this family does not deserve her." A sharp, violent gasp tore out of my throat. The blue ink on the page suddenly blurred. A heavy, hot tear dropped straight from my chin and hit the dry, yellowed paper. He knew. He had always known. My silent sacrifices, the grueling months of eating 25-cent noodles on a freezing linoleum floor, the hazard pay. I wired home from a combat zone. None of it was invisible. He was too sick and too weak to stand up to Vanessa and Darren, but he saw exactly what they were doing. He saw me. He validated my entire existence in those sloppy lines of ink. Marcus reached across the space between the seats. He unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled me hard against his chest. He did not say a single word. He did not offer hollow, empty civilian platitudes. He just wrapped his heavy, warm arms around my shoulders and let me break. For the first time in 38 years, I allowed myself to be completely weak. I buried my face into his charcoal suit jacket and I wept. I cried out the exhaustion. I cried out the brutal betrayal. I cried out the heavy, suffocating burden of being the family workhorse. I cried until my lungs burned and my eyes were swollen shut. And with every tear that soaked into his suit, the ghosts of my past were permanently washed away. 3 days later, I was back on the West Coast, sitting at my metal desk inside my logistics office at Camp Pendleton. The harsh white fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside my window, a platoon of Marines was calling cadence in the distance. My cell phone buzzed flat against the metal desk. The screen lit up. It was a massive wall of text from a number I had not saved, but I knew exactly who it was. "Carly, please, you have to save me." Darren took the rental car and ran away in the middle of the night. The county sheriff showed up at 8 this morning and locked the doors. The bank took the house. I am sitting on the curb with 2 suitcases. I have absolutely nothing left. You are rich now. Just wire me $10,000 so I can get an apartment. Please, we are sisters. Family has to help family. I read the words twice. Family has to help family. This was the desperate, pathetic plea from the exact same woman who wore my military uniform to mock me while she slept with my fiancé. The woman who tried to demote me to a coffee girl in front of a room full of relatives. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel a spike of anger. I felt nothing but absolute freezing apathy. I did not type out a long, angry paragraph explaining why she deserved this fate. I did not curse at her or preach about karma. A commanding officer does not negotiate with domestic terrorists. I raised my right hand. I tapped the small information icon in the top right corner of the screen. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the menu. The letters were glowing in bright red. Block caller. I pressed my finger against the glass. The screen went black. Communication was permanently severed. The toxic tumor was finally cut out of my life, thrown into the medical waste bin where it belonged. The next morning, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my master bedroom. I was buttoning up my Service Alpha uniform, preparing for a high-level briefing at the Pentagon. I smoothed my hands down the crisp olive drab fabric, ensuring there was not a single wrinkle. I brushed my fingertips over the colorful ribbons pinned directly over my heart, representing every campaign, every sacrifice, and every single time I survived an ambush. I reached up and traced the jagged scar under my jawline. Darren used to call it an ugly flaw. Marcus called it a mark of courage. I called it a certified proof of survival. I picked up the heavy metal tube of lipstick from the vanity counter. I pulled the cap off. The color was a deep, dark burgundy, the exact shade of dried blood on a battlefield. I dragged the heavy color across my lips. It was not meant to look pretty. It was not meant to seek approval from anyone in the civilian world. It was the war paint of a woman who had walked straight through the fires of hell and returned carrying the torch. I squared my shoulders. I locked eyes with my own reflection in the glass. The domestic war was over. I had won. Do not ever let people who lack a moral compass look at your life and try to determine your price tag. If you loved this story of brutal karma, please drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.